we get started? Because it's 5 o'clock and I do on time, as everybody knows. Okay, I'm going to read this so I cover all the important stuff that Bill has done in his life. Bill is a longtime friend of our organization and was a valuable member of our board of directors for what? 3 or 4 years? 12 years? He's a retired attorney who practiced in Columbia for many years, but also has strong ties to and love for Edisto. His grandmother had a house on Edisto Beach where Bill spent most of his summers, and he now owns that home, so that's where you can find him when he's here. Bill is married to Mahaley, who is right there, and they are the parents of 3 children and 9 grandchildren, one of whom just happens to be my best buddies with my grandson Smith, so we have a connection that way too. Bill has long been involved in organizations that celebrate and preserve the history of South Carolina. In addition to our organization, he is the chairman of the Board of Managers of the South Carolina Historical Society, vice chairman for the South Carolina Revolutionary Sesquicentennial Commission. You want to explain what that is? Most people don't know that word. The Liberty Trail, the South Carolina Battlefield Preservation Trust, the American Friends of Lafayette, and the Santa Elena Foundation, just to name a few. He belongs to a lot of historical societies and gets around. He stays busy. And we're grateful to the South Carolina Historical Society who is sponsoring this lecture by Bill. So,
you can't take that.
I'm not. I'm going to take you. Here he is.
Gretchen and I have only known each other for about 40, 45 years, and she's never been that nice. Okay, I've got some goals. They may be out of this world, but they're, number one, I hope I'm going to tell you some things you haven't heard before. Number two, I hope I'm going to correct some things that you've heard that may not be exactly right. Number three, I'm hoping at least 2 or 3 of you will take a road trip. So those are kind of my goals. And I'm going to kind of bear this in mind that I'm coming from an education from a South Carolina school. Some of you are from off and you won't understand that. But I'm going to talk about what I learned in school, and I think most of the people who are from South Carolina learned the same thing, and maybe they taught the same thing other places as well. Dickie, close the door. Okay.
I don't want to close the door on Kathy.
So let's start off. When I started American history, the first thing we heard was a little ditty. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Then real quickly, we went to Jamestown, and then pretty soon after that, to the Pilgrims. And then, of course, in the 8th grade in South Carolina history, we learned that the most important date in the history of mankind was 1670. They still think that in Charleston. You all been there enough. But what I just flashed a little bit in the front was, you can see how I've set this thing up, and what's missing is what I would like to talk a lot about today. The thing that is missing is the first recorded place name in South Carolina anywhere that we've been able to find in the world. And one of the reasons it's missing, I believe, is that our education system is English-centric. If they didn't speak English, they're unimportant. And a lot of our education system is that way. And the place I'm talking about is Santa Elena, and of course that's Spanish. Spanish, they didn't matter. What could they have done for South Carolina? Well, I hope that you'll be a little more interested in that as we go along today. So let's go back to 1492. A couple of things I'm reminding you of. I'm sure you knew these things. By 1492, a guy named Martin Luther, that was his full name, started something called the Protestant Reformation. Catholics and Protestants who used the same Bible, had the same 10 Commandments, were killing each other because they didn't worship in the same manner. Somehow, if you don't worship the way I do, it's okay if I kill you. Doesn't make sense to me, but that's the way they looked at things. If you didn't worship their way, you were a heretic, and that's sort of the basis of one of the things we talk about here today. So that's part of it. The second thing is, at the time we're talking about, Spain did not exist. It was Castile and Aragon, but the king and queen Isabella and Ferdinand were married, and they eventually merged the country. We're just going to call it Spain. In 1492, Spain was bankrupt. You probably read that Isabella had to hawk some jewels or something to send Columbus over here. And we know that she had sold most of her gowns and had hawked a large amount of her jewelry. The reason they were bankrupt is, and this is something that many people forget, for about 750 years, the Moors, who had come in across the Straits of Gibraltar 750 years before and had occupied the Iberian Peninsula and much of France for that length of time, they were finally pushing the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula, out of Spain, and that had been very expensive. So think about 1492, Spain is bankrupt. In 1494, by that time Columbus is back, the Pope is Catholic. He decides he's going to allocate all this new area to two countries, which both happen to be Catholic. Portugal gets Brazil and the west coast of Africa as their primary area, and Spain gets the rest. Now, that sounds unfair to us because we know the size of the continents at this point in time, but we need to look at it through the eyes that they were looking at it at that time. And I'm going to use a map that's out of our chronology, but I'll get back to it in a moment, but I think it's good to look at it. This is 1526, late in 1526. Juan Vespucci published this. He was an Italian living in Spain. He's okay with Europe and Africa, but when he gets over on the other side of the water, he's not quite as good. But you can see that it doesn't appear to be a whole lot of difference in the landmass in what they thought. And while I'm here, let me point out, the Spanish, for the first 20 years or so, were sticking in the Caribbean, however you want to say it. But they were mostly focused on Cuba and Santo Domingo / Haiti, we think of it now. It took a while, but in 1513, they decided to send a man north who you've all heard of, Ponce de Leon. He went and looked for the Fountain of Youth, right? No. Never looked for the Fountain of Youth. Something attached to him afterwards. And it's very unpleasant, but what he was looking for is slaves. The Spanish didn't have any problem. They were very good at treating the heretics as heretics. And since most of the Native Americans would not convert to Catholicism, they worked them to death. And that was okay, but they ran out of them. And they needed more slaves. That's why Ponce de Leon goes north. They had heard there was another big island up there. They didn't know how big, we do. But they were looking for a big island. Ponce de Leon goes north, it's in the spring, it's a pretty day. He sees the land, he didn't get any slaves to speak of, but he named that place La Florida. Obviously this would have been on the peninsula that we call Florida today. But remember, for the purposes of when I'm talking today, La Florida is the name of the Spanish province for everything north of Mexico. That's the whole United States except Hawaii, among other things. Mexico they call New Spain. Everything else is La Florida, and that's kind of important as we go along. That's 1513. About 6 years later, Cortez invades Mexico. He defeats the Aztecs. Aztecs had a tremendously intelligent society. They're worth reading about. They also had a lot of gold and silver. And of course, it was appropriated by the Spaniards. It started going back across the ocean. This is 1519. First time money is going that way. For the most part, Spain has been paying for things coming this way. Then in 1526, the Spanish decided there's something up there. We've had a couple of people go up to this La Florida place, and it seems a little bigger than we thought it was, so maybe we better put some settlements up there. They get together over 600 settlers, and they sail north. They go up this coastline that they're calling La Florida, and they sail into this huge natural harbor. It's a beautiful place. And they look for the most prominent point of land there. They named that point of land Capo, which is cape or headland of Santa Elena. That's where we find the first recorded place name. Santa Elena. And you'll have to take my word for it, it's on this 1526 map. There's no way I could blow it up big enough for you all to see it, but you know, I'm just a recovering lawyer, so you can take my word for it. This crowd then sails out of that harbor, they go up the coast, they get to about the North Carolina line. We think we found the ship, but one of their major ships is sunk and it's got most of their supplies on it. They turn back south, but they were supposed to make a settlement, so they pull in, we think now it's Sapelo or Sapelo, whatever you do, in Georgia Island. And they start their settlement, which they call San Miguel de Galdapi. There's over 600 of them to begin with. 3.5 months, there are 150 left. They don't know how to start settlements. They got the wrong people, they've got the wrong stuff. They have disease coming from the Indians. The Indians attack them. The big thing is they start fighting among each other. And in the first mutiny, interestingly enough, something special happened, which I'll get to in just a second. But after 3.5 months and only 150 of them left, they decided they're closing up shop. They went back to Havana. Now, this is the second bit of different news or different interpretation of what happened from what we have seen. Back before the pandemic, Virginia, which I think is somewhat creative in history normally, started a new marketing campaign for Jamestown. And they were very proud of the fact that the first African-American slaves to enter the North American continent came into Jamestown in 1619. And you all know this 1619 date has been used for so many things, and it's false. I mean, it's totally wrong. Because we know that there were 35 or 40 slaves at San Miguel de Galdapi, but it was Spanish, so it didn't count. Those slaves, by the way, were pretty intelligent folk. The first time the Spaniards started shooting at each other, they headed west. And so that would have been the first opportunity in my mind for the DNA of Africa to reach the DNA of North America in a significant portion. But that would have been the first African-American slaves to enter our North American continent. 7 years later, Pizarro goes down, he goes across the isthmus, he goes down to Peru. He conquers the Incas, again, a really, really intelligent society with a lot of advantages that we didn't have in Europe, and a lot of gold and silver. So more money starts going back across the ocean to Spain. So that by the 1550s, the middle of the 1550s, Spain, from being bankrupt 60 years before, is the wealthiest and the most powerful country in Europe. But gold and silver are heavy. The ships they had could have docked at our yacht club down here. It's a little bit pretentiously named. But some people, when I first started this, said those ships were about as long as the Clemson First Down. That's about right. They were not particularly stable either, but they had all this gold and silver to put on them. So how in the world could they get them across the ocean? They came up with a plan. Now, I'm pretty straightforward. Pardon me if I hurt somebody's feelings. What they decided to do was pull everything together that they could steal from the Indians, because that's what they were doing, and take it to Havana during the year. And it had to be there by about the middle of July, because the 1st of July to the middle of July, a fleet of ships would come over from Spain. Everybody in the world knew about this fleet. It was called the Treasure Fleet. They would come into Spain, they would load up all this gold and silver. At times there were 120 of them. I mean, you know, it was a lot of ships because they were small and there was a lot of gold and silver. And they would leave in late August or early September. Follow the route that you see on this till they got up about the area right above the North Carolina-South Carolina line. And about the middle of October, the prevailing winds were blowing hard enough and strong enough to take them back to Europe. When you were coming over, you normally went south from Europe, and about the middle of March, 1st of April, it would blow you in where those arrows are into the islands down at the lower part of the thing. So you came over in the spring, you went back in the fall for the most part. You could do it otherwise, it'd just take longer. But they needed to do it because they had all these ships that were trying to stay together. Now, they had two major problems. Number one, most of you I've seen around this area before, and you understand that what the problem is in late August and early September, right? First one this year is called Beryl. That's Hurricane Alley where they're going in these little ships. Second one, I'm going to give you the name of a living individual today, and I think most of you at least will understand the second problem. Ever heard of Johnny Depp? Pirates of the Caribbean. Everybody in the world knew about this treasure fleet, and it was not unusual for people to gang together and have their own little ships along that coast of Florida or in the islands and try to pick off one of those treasure fleet ships. You never know how much was on those ships at a time. I can tell you that in 1804 at the Battle of Cape St. Mary's, a British fleet captured only four ships. And the value of the bullion in those ships were over $35 million today. Four ships. 120 ships, you get the picture? Okay, so that's kind of where we are at that point in time. In the 1550s, the mid-1550s, 1556 to be specific, Spain crowned a new king, a guy named Philip II. Never heard of Philip II before I started reading about Santa Helena. Now I think he's probably one of the top 5 most important kings in the history of Europe. For one thing, he served from 1556 to 1598, which was unusual longevity for people like that. He was also with the wealthiest country and the most powerful country in Europe for the most part. He also, interestingly enough, at different times, essentially ruled almost every square inch of Europe. At one time, he married the widow of a king of England. She had a son that was 2 years short of his being able to take the throne. So Philip is ruling Spain and England at the same time. And I mean, he does that across the continent at different times. He's a pretty important guy. He came up in 1 year. 1556 he's crowned. In 1557 he issues a major edict which sets up Spanish policy for the next 35 years as far as the New World is concerned. He is a politician. We're in the middle of a political race right now. You know what you're getting in the mailbox, driving Adam crazy. I got to have money, he said. I got to have every bit of that treasure fleet. I can't lose any of it. We have to have it all. So here's what I want you to do. We protect the treasure fleet. Number 2, we establish settlements all up and down this coast because some of these other countries are trying to claim our land. Remember, these guys are Catholic. That land was given them by the Pope. That's God giving them that land. They were serious about this. The Spanish they were very religious as long as you worship like they did. Then he said, and this is his words, the first place to be settled will be Santa Elena. The capital will be Santa Elena. The most prominent point will be Santa Elena. You see where it is. And then the third thing that he had for them to do is build me a road from Santa Elena to Mexico. Now, they got no perception of what the size of the continent is. In fact, there are reasons they think the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains are the same mountain range. So it's not quite that bad, but that really is what he said. And here's his theory. We'll take all that loot that we steal from everybody else across land to Santa Elena. We can leave Santa Elena and get above that line where those winds come up in about 2 weeks. So we leave a whole lot later in the year. And we go straight out into the ocean and then turn north, and there's nowhere for the pirates to hang out. It was a pretty good idea. So that was the way. Oh, and by the way, number 4 was find me a way around the top of this thing, this La Florida thing, and get me to China like we were trying to do in 1492. So that's where we are in 1562. The French government is significantly interested in claiming some of this land. And so the French government calls in, the French government at this point is about 80% of the French people, about 80% Catholic and 20% Huguenots. Now, I've been informed that you don't say French Huguenots because all the Huguenots were French. But of course most of us use those together anyway. But anyway, they call in a Huguenot who had been sailing around the globe for 30 years, a guy named Jean Ribault. They said to Ribault, what we want to do is go over and claim some land over in this La Florida place. We want you to go over there and put up a bunch of billboards that say, France has been here and we claim this land. Put them all up and down the coast, and then we want you to start a settlement. Let me explain. The billboards were these huge stone columns that had the French royal coat of arms carved on them. So it was, they were staking their claim, so to speak. So Ribault comes over, and he does that up the coast a little ways, and finally he sails into what he called the most magnificent harbor I've seen in all my 30 years of sailing the globe. And remember, he's a Protestant. He's working for the Catholics. He immediately names that harbor Port Royal. Got a picture of that? He goes over to the same place that the Spanish in 1526 had called Capo de Santa Elena. And he starts his settlement there. This is a picture of Ribault on the left, drawn by a sailor on his expedition in 1562. It probably is what he looks like, or looked like. Over to the right is another artist on the same ship. We just don't know whether it was the same artist. It probably was. And the drawing was originally in black and white. Ted Turner colorized it for us. And so this is the little triangular island where that Capo di Santa Elena was. For short, we call it Paris Island. The Marines. Okay, so Ribault builds a settlement there. He leaves 28 men there. He says, I'm going to go back across the ocean with these prevailing winds, and I'll be back in April with another bunch of ships and everything. So he takes off, leaves the 28 men. When he gets back, France is in the middle of really dire fights between the Protestants and the Catholics, so he can't get any help. He goes to England. They think he's a French spy. They throw him in jail. Doesn't matter. After about 3.5 months, those 28 guys are not quite that many. They build a boat and head back across the ocean. They get back late in 1563. The French king finds out about it and says, I told y'all I want a settlement over there. He gets one of Ribault's lieutenants, because Ribault's still in jail. Says, get your groups together, go over there and start me a settlement. The guy goes across, and in 1564 he stops at the St. Johns River down in Florida. That's where Jacksonville is. And he builds Fort Caroline. Charles Fort was the first fort on Santa Elena named for the French king. Fort Caroline is named for the French queen. And about that time, Philip gets all the news about this thing, and he's starting to get angry. He calls in his main, oh, by the way, the bottom half of this slide is an artist's conception of one of those billboards. And it was painted as best we can tell about 100 years after the fact, so it's just an artist's conception, but at least it gives you some idea about what they thought they were like at that point in time. So, Philip calls in Pedro Menendez de Avillas. Menendez is kind of his jack of all trades. He says, Menendez, here's what I want you to do. There's a bunch of these Protestants over there from France in our area, in La Florida. I want you to go over to Fort Caroline and destroy Fort Caroline. This was not capture them. This was not ask them to go home. They are heretics. Destroy them. Then I want you to go to Santa Elena, like I've been trying to get people to do since 1557, and build me a principal city, make it the capital city. After that, we need more settlements up and down the coast, and build me my land route to Mexico. So, Menendez starts gathering troops. French hear about it. By this time, Ribaud is out. They tell Ribaud to start gathering troops. They start gathering these two expeditions. They're racing across the Atlantic. They both know about each other. Menendez is to the south. Storm comes up, wrong time of year for a hurricane, it's just a storm. Scatters at the Spanish fleet, damages several of the ships. Ribaud gets to Fort Caroline first, and he starts building up the defenses very well. Menendez wanders in with one other ship, I think, and he sees that he doesn't have enough force to take it at that point, so he turns south so that he can gather his other ships together and try to attack the French. He sails down the coast until he finds a nice looking harbor, and he didn't have a good map or anything, so he just pulled into this harbor, and that was on August the 9th of 1565. He started a temporary military base camp to attack the French, which he named St. Augustine. And that's how St. Augustine became the first permanent settlement in North America. Menendez is down there. It's August the 9th when he gets to, of 1565, when he gets there. He starts calling his ships in, getting his people together, but his ships are hurt. He's got to attack the fort up there, so he's got to go by land. They start marching up the coast. At the same time, Ribaud knows that Menendez is down there and he wants to kill them. He's got all his ships, puts all his soldiers on the ships. They start going down in a clockwise manner toward St. Augustine. By this time, it's late August. What happens? Hurricane destroys the French fleet. The remains, there are about 80 of them that get ashore down at where number 5. Now, number 5, you probably can't read it. That's Matanzas Inlet. It's right above the Atlantic Ocean thing there. The one right above that is St. Augustine, and then up at the top is where Fort Caroline is. Menendez marches through the rain and wind, captures Fort Caroline, and pursuant to Philip's orders, he gives them two choices. They're all Huguenots. You can convert, or I'm going to kill you. Pretty straightforward. They won't convert. He kills them. He sails back to St. Augustine, finds out about the other French down the coast, goes and captures them, same thing, convert or I'll kill you, and he kills them, including Ribaud. That Matanzas Inlet, I think, is Spanish for slaughters. It's still named that. Okay, so at this point, he gets his ships ready to go, and they sail up to Santa Elena, because he was told to open the capital at that point. This is where Santa Elena is. Many of you have been in the military. You'll understand what I'm saying. Santa Elena is at the point approximately on this slide where you can see. Charles Fort is about 200 yards, 300 yards, a little bit northeast on this slide. They're very close together. Both of them, I'm off my chronology, but it's something important. Both of those are pristine archaeological sites because the Spanish and the French picked the prettiest place. Any of you who've been in the military knows where the prettiest place is on every military base. It's called the Officers' Golf Course. Santa Elena was under the 17th hole. There was no building out there. There were no tanks running over it, no landing craft, nothing else. You don't fool with the Officers' Golf Course. So it protected that archaeological find for it. In any case, that's where the place is. Menendez establishes Santa Elena on April the 21st of 1566. April the 21st of 1566, the man who is the Captain General, military commander, and Governor, civil commander of La Florida, establishes his base. That makes Santa Elena the first capital of the United States, and Menendez the first president. Anybody tell you that in school? Why not? I mean, why wouldn't we be proud of that? Many of us grew up really loving South Carolina. We were proud to be South Carolinians. I've been trying to figure out how to get my grandchildren to be proud of South Carolinians. They don't know the history. This is the kind of thing we ought to be advertising, I think. And if you want something to advertise to get more people to come, that's a good thing to start working on. So that's my position. Now, Menendez is pretty sharp. He leaves in about 2 weeks. He's leaving a guy named Esteban de los Alos, his lieutenant governor there. He goes back to Havana. He immediately gets up a bunch of ships with men and materiel, and by the first part of July, they arrive back at Santa Elena. Of course, the Spanish have already started arguing among each other, but they get there in time to save things. He sends a guy named Juan Pardo, Captain Juan Pardo, with 150 troops. Pardo works with Esteban de los Alos. By the end of November, they've got Santa Elena on a functioning level. De los Alos calls Pardo in and says, okay, Juan, take 150 of your people and build that road to Mexico City. And then come back here. By the way, the French are coming back probably in April, so you got to be back by the middle of March. All you got to do is walk from Beaufort to Mexico City, build a road, and get back in 3.5 months. You know, no problem. Amazingly enough, the guy does it. This is his route. He kind of went northwest up to Branchville, turned right, went over to about Orangeburg, turned left, went through Lake Wateree up by Spartanburg, into the middle of North Carolina, and then turned left again and went to Dollyland. And then he came back in 3.5 months. The reason he's going that way is that's where the Indian Pass was. The French didn't come, and so he did it again the next year. There's a great book on the Juan Pardo expedition. It's a super reading, but we don't have time to really talk about this. In 1569, Menendez sends another large group, 300 and something settlers over. We found the remains of at least 90 houses. There was a church there were several stores, they had several forts, all kinds of things. In 1571, Menendez moves his family there, and they build this beautiful house. Now, because of people's innate disbelief in lawyers, early on when I started talking about this beautiful house, people challenged me, you don't know what his house looked like. I do. When we sent experts to Madrid, we found that the Catholic Church and the Spanish government keep better records than the Germans. We found the plans of Menendez's house. And so we knew the measurements, and when, of course, the Indians burned it when it closed, and we found the footprint. So today, I could take you in your folding chair and set you up with your feet right where Menendez warmed his feet 450 years ago. I'm not talking about the general area, I'm talking about right here. How many specificity, significant places have you heard of in history? You never hear that sort of specificity, but we can put you right there. It's fascinating to me, I guess because I read so much history, but in any case. Soon after this, Menendez is called back to Europe. Philip needs him. Excuse me. He dies in 1574. After he is no longer the governor, things kind of go to heck in a handbasket. And by 1576, the women in the community convinced the governor to close up Santa Elena. And they shut it down. They move back, and the capital moves with them to St. Augustine. So we were only capital for 10 years. We were only the capital of the United States for 10 years, but that's pretty good. So the people in St. Augustine and Havana panic because Philip's serious about wanting Santa Elena. So they immediately get up a military expedition, and an interesting thing, they got a prefab fort. It was made out of Legos. But it really, they put it up in a matter of 2 days when they got down there. But they go back, they reopen Santa Elena. It stays occupied until 1587. Now, those of you who are nerds, history buffs, know that the Spanish Armada was supposed to leave in 1587. Actually, Philip wanted Menendez to be the head of it, but he died before he could do it. They didn't leave until 1588, but 1587 is when the Spanish decided that Santa Elena is too far north, we can't keep it up, and so they closed it down. Santa Elena was there for 21 years. it's a pretty important place, I think. But 1587, think about that date. What happens 20 years later? Jamestown. Just 20 years. You know, you don't put all this together till you start making, get away from me, making a point of it. I was told that when those 3 English ships sailed into Chesapeake Bay and landed on the point of land between the York and the James Rivers, that the Indians treated them as gods. Number one, the Indians had canoes about as long as the boats down at the yacht club. The English had what we think are small, but they were a whole lot bigger than the English canoes, and they had all these sails up, and they had cannon, and they had iron breastplates, and they had iron weapons, and they had iron tools, and for you women, they had iron needles. Have you ever tried to sew with a bone or a wood needle? So all of their technology was such, we were told, that the Indians treated them as gods. And another thing, the Indians in that area had an oral history of the fact that in some time in the future, white men with hair on their faces would come back. Had to be Vikings. But that was their oral history. So that was, we were told, part of the thing about being treated as gods. And even though they were treated as gods at first, the Europeans had a way of treating the Indians that, you know, eventually they made the Indians mad and they got in a fight and they were battling each other. And I grew up in the Walt Disney era, and some of you did. I loved his movies and his TV things and history, and I read history from this place that's about to fall down up here. It used to be the school. And the image I have is this blonde Englishman with his hands tied behind his back, kneeling on the ground. He's got this big iron breastplate on. And Arnold Schwarzenegger is standing there in a pair of bikini briefs, about to just brain him with this huge club. And this young Indian maiden runs across the clearing and throws herself over the top of the Englishman, looks up and says, "Daddy, Daddy, please don't kill him." Pocahontas was my childhood girlfriend. She really was. I read about all these girls, but I thought she was really cool because she had saved John Smith's life. I got mad when she didn't marry John Smith. You all know that she married John Rolfe. I don't know how many of you know, I'm probably reminding you of this. When she went over to England with John Rolfe, she converted to Catholicism, she was presented to the king, and eventually she got pregnant and started back across the, no, she was already pregnant, I guess, when she started back, but in any case, she had a baby, and both of them got ill. She was put ashore on the peninsula called Cornwall, and she was buried there. For hundreds of years, that monument said, Lady Rebecca Rolfe, and that's all. In the last few years, somebody put up a monument right beside it. They didn't tear down the old monument. They put up a monument right beside it and said, let us explain. She really was Pocahontas, and, you know, one of the American Indians. So they explained the thing, but anyway, that, as I say, that's kind of a sideline. But my point to you is, there is no way when the English sailed into Chesapeake Bay, they were treated as gods. It ain't going to happen, as they say sometimes. So let me go back and tell you why I say that. Maybe I won't convince you of it, but I think I will. I'm going back before Ribault. In 1561, the Spanish had heard about Chesapeake Bay, and they really thought it might be a way to get to China. So they wanted to start a settlement up there. So when the treasure fleet went up, one ship was specially prepared. It turned left instead of turning right and went into Chesapeake Bay. It landed on the peninsula between the York and the James Rivers. And they set up all this good stuff on the side of the ocean there. They weren't there but 7 days. They didn't make anybody mad. They had a lot of wine. They had a lot of cheap farm-made materials. They had colored cloth that the Indians didn't have. They had beads. They had copper pots. They had iron tools. They had all this great stuff, and it was kind of like a state fair out there. They called all the Indians in, gave them a little wine, and fed them, and said, we're going to make you the most important Indians in this whole place. We're going to have a trading post here. It's going to have cheap foreign-made goods at ridiculously low prices. We're going to call it Walmart. And you're going to be important because everybody's going to want to come to see the Indians that have Walmart. All you have to do is give us 2 of your young men to go with us where we can get back right here. Next year, we'll be back next spring. So 2 young men are chosen. Now, whether they were volunteers or not, we don't know. One of them, a chieftain's son, was named Paquiquineo. If you're taking notes, that's a lot of vowels. The other guy had a hard name to pronounce, so I'm not even going to try. But Paquiquineo, the chief's son, and his friend get on the boat. They sail across the Atlantic Ocean. They land in Cadiz. They march to Madrid. They meet Philip. They're in Madrid several months. They come back the next year, but they don't go to Chesapeake Bay. They go to Mexico for some reason. They're in Mexico for about 4 years. In 1566, they get on a ship with some Dominican friars. The idea is to go back and open the Walmart. Storm comes up, blows them by, and they go back to Europe. They stay, they don't come back until 1570. This is almost 10 years. 1570, they're in Havana. They're put on a ship with 9 Jesuit priests. Now, those of you who know about the Jesuits, that's a serious group of people. So you got 9 Jesuit priests, Paquiquineo and his friend. They sail up to Santa Elena, and they talk Alonzo, the tailor's son, he's about 11, 12, into going with them as an altar boy. They sail up to the Chesapeake Bay. They land on the peninsula between the York and the James Rivers. They march inland about 10 miles, and they start clearing land for what they call the Aga Station. Paquiquineo and his friends stay with them initially, but the Indians start coming in, and they see Paquiquineo and his friend. They think they're dead. Been gone 10 years. So they welcome them back into tribe. Paquiquineo and his friends start spending long weekends at the Indian villages. Then they don't come back. And this is history. I'm not making this up. It was more fun to be an Indian than it was to be a Catholic. And there's something called monogamy had something to do with that. And this is in the history. But after a bit, Paquiquineo and his friend led a war party and wiped out the 9 Jesuits. They captured Alonzo, made him a part of the tribe, and that was the end of the Aga Station. Menendez hears about it. He gets mad. He sends an expedition. He wants to capture the 2 of them and hang them. He can't get Paquiquineo and his friend. They do get Alonzo back, but because they can't get Paquiquineo, they just hang 35 or 40 Indians who happen to be standing around, and that makes them feel good. Now, what does that have to do with me saying they would never have thought they were gods? Powhatan was the name of that big Indian, remember? That's what they called the chief. That wasn't his name, that was what they called him. John Smith is the guy kneeling down. Pocahontas, they're all real people in history. Whether or not that little scene occurred, because I don't know whether you realize this, but it was only written down one place. That was something John Smith wrote 20 years later. But anyway, he was somewhat of a rapscallion. But Powhatan, at this point, is somebody different from what you would think. When the 2 young men got back, the Powhatan was our guy's father. Paquiquineo became Powhatan. Paquiquineo had a son who became Powhatan. Paquiquineo's son is Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Paquiquineo is my girlfriend's grandfather. We know this. This is true. The specificity, again, is amazing what we found out. It's exciting if you really like history. What's that got to do with them not being gods? Paquiquineo has spent 10 years, and his friend, in Europe. Part of the time, he's 4 years in Mexico watching them work the Indians there to death. He's learned to read, write, and speak Spanish because he converted, and you had to at that point. The friar, he got sick one time, and they convinced him he was going to die and go to heck. I'm being nice, I'm in church. If you didn't convert, they converted. But you don't think when he got home he told them about these people? They would have realized immediately these are illegal immigrants. Why didn't we build a wall? I mean, there's no way they would have thought they were gods. So That's important to people like me, but might not be to you all. By the way, during the pandemic, we found the remains of the Ajakan mission. It's less than 10 miles from Jamestown. It's the same place. It's where all this happened. Okay, now let's jump on ahead. Jamestown was 1607. The Spanish in St. Augustine tried to supply the Indians in Virginia with equipment to attack the English. That's still their land. They're claiming that land. They're mad. This is 1607. 67 years later, the English come down right up the coast at Charlestown. They really are unhappy. And they very much try to get the Indians here to attack the English. 1686, a group of soldiers of fortune, pirates, I don't know, ne'er-do-wells, whatever, a fairly large group of them got together. They sailed up the coast to attack the English. They wiped out Stewartstown. There's a new book by Peter Moore, Carolina's Lost Colony, I think. Stewartstown was a Scots-Irish settlement where Beaufort is right now. But they pretty much wiped it out. Some of those Scots-Irish, Scots Presbyterians came here. Then they came right out to Point-au-Pines, and they burned Paul Grimmel's house. And Gretchen has the foundation of that thing on her tour every now and then. And we're talking about something that's really close to us. And it's just right out here, but again, a storm came up, so they didn't go and attack Charleston. 1707, Queen Anne's War, the Spanish sent an expedition that attacked Charleston. They were beaten off. 1715, you've never heard of the Yamasee War. It's a very good thing to study. The Yamasee, the Cherokee, the Creeks, a bunch of the Indians got together and attacked the white colonists. Over 20% of the white colonists of South Carolina were killed in the space of several weeks. And all of the whites pulled back, bringing some of their slaves, but not all of them, pulled back into Charleston. We almost went down the tubes with the Yamasee War. It wasn't until 1763 that the Spanish gave up their claims to La Florida. But Santa Elena must be settled before all other places. That's a direct translation of Philip II. He issued that in 1557. He reissued the whole thing again in 1559, and that was the strategy for 35 years. Santa Elena was there for 21 years with a very brief break of several months. It was the capital for 10 years. Santa Elena, or 200 yards from it, is the site of the first attempted Protestant settlement in North America. It's right down the coast at Parris Island, and nobody tells us about it. I don't exactly understand why. Anyway, very quickly, assuming I can do that. In 1923, the Marines started doing archaeology. By 1926, they convinced the U.S. Congress that they had found Charles Fort, the first Protestant attempted settlement. The Congress supplied them with enough money that they have this huge column, concrete column, sort of like the billboards that Ribot found, and they put a bunch of signage around it. It wasn't until 1995 that we found out that what they had really found was Santa Elena, and we found out where the real Charles Fort was. It's 200 or 300 yards away, like I said. We continue to have archaeology at these sites. They dig down, they do whatever they can do, and then they close it up. We never had enough money to do as much as we would like. But it's right there. So now I'm back to my goals. I don't know whether I've made anybody think that they might want to read a book, but if you do, I've got a list I'd be happy to provide you. I hope you will think about this and understand that that period of time between 1492 and 1607 was important for South Carolina. And then that road trip. You know, Beaufort's, what, an hour and 15 minutes? They've got really good restaurants. They got good B&Bs. They got all sorts of history, not just this. If you get your new driver's license with the star on it, your registration, car registration, and your proof of insurance, and go to the main gate at Parris Island, they will sign you in and send you to the little museum. It's really a good museum. And from the museum, there are signs that take you right down to the place where you can see where Menendez warmed his feet 450 years ago. Now, most of my time these days is talking about celebrating, as Gretchen said, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. This is 200 years before that. We don't have that sort of time here. This is something we should, in my mind, bring to ourselves, take advantage of, however you want to say it, but we at least ought to know it and we ought to be taught it in school. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I'll be happy to answer any questions, but I've probably gone longer than I should have. But if, ma'am?
We've got time for questions.
Okay, so if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Lou, you look like you're going to jump.
Oh, yeah. So, Port Royal, the depth of the water there versus New York, do you?
I don't get in boats. But my understanding, well, that was the major headquarters for the blockade of the southern states during the war between states. So they had, did you know that up here between Seabrook and Edisto, before the April 7th, 1863 attack on Charleston, some of the people from Edisto counted 100 and something federal vessels in that little inlet right there. Port Royal's a whole lot bigger than that. And where the Union set up their major piers is right across from Parris Island, where Fort Fremont is now, the old Spanish American fort. But I think it must be plenty deep.
I had a question about you said there's a museum in Parris Island.
Yeah.
They sure don't seem, at least maybe I'm the only person in the state who doesn't know it existed, but I've never heard of it.
That was the principal marine museum until they built a new one at Dumfries about 10 years, 12 years ago.
So it's more about the marine facility?
It's about the
than
Marines
this
and
district?
this part of South Carolina.
Oh.
It's an overlap, but the Marines, it is about Parris Island, but it's
Yeah.
also about Beaufort County
And the history.
and the Marines. But it's worth going to. Yes, ma'am.
I interned at Parris Island Museum from April to, from January to April this past year. Literally, if you go to the gate, Marines will be like, I don't know the museum, we'll send you to the inspection gate, they'll look at you weird, be like, why? Because Marines don't really care about the museum. But as marine history, all of it is sectioned about just South Carolina in general. They do tours, like if you call a museum, go, do you even know the tour? They'll take you out there on a little tram. If not, they give you a piece of paper with a QR code for an audio tour, where they just take you around to the different sides of like marine history, and then you can't actually go and walk out to Santa Elena and a big pillar that's in the wrong spot that says this is Charlesport. Like, you walk out there. Again, Marines will kind of look at you weird, but you say, I want a museum, and they're like, okay.
And let me return a question to you. How mad did you get at Steve Wise? How mad did you get at Steve Wise?
I didn't really talk to him all that much. He wasn't there when I was there.
He's a friend of mine that runs the museum.
He wasn't there half the time. I worked with Emily May most of the time, and he would just kind of come in and out and do whatever he wanted. So.
Yes, sir.
Didn't he follow up with Pocahontas' baby when she was pregnant and died?
I think the baby died as well, is my recollection.
No,
She did not.
she's
Okay.
my 11th great grandmother. I'm living proof that that baby.
Ah, that's what's wrong. I mean,
Well,
I did not
maybe
realize
she
that.
was
Came
first
back
in
to
genes.
Virginia.
that's probably why I'm so attracted to you, Gretchen.
Bloodletting.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What diseases would the European colonists have caught from Native Americans?
I'm sorry, I am really deaf.
What kind of disease would the European colonists have died from that they got from America?
You know, I cannot tell you that, but I can tell you that while the Europeans brought tremendous just disaster to the native tribes, the tribes did have some diseases that the Europeans caught. A lot of the disease they caught was not being able to find enough food. And the Indians didn't want to give it to them by the time they started stealing from them. But I would love to be able to tell you that, but I can't. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know where in Cornwall more specifically that Pocahontas is buried?
No, ma'am, but I am sure my phone could tell you. Yes, sir.
Where can you find more about Pardo's trip up into North Carolina? Back to
There's a book called The Juan Pardo Expeditions by a guy named Charles Hudson. It's, you know, you can get it on, I go to bookfinder.com. That's the cheapest place to get books. But it's very easy to get a copy of it.
Did you say you had a list of books that you'd suggest?
I do. I've got a list. You can take pictures of it up here. It doesn't have the one Pardo thing on it. I didn't realize that until I was looking at it earlier today. I haven't given this talk in a while, so. Okay. Who wants to go home? Yes.